it's probably worth kind of pointing out that as someone from the UK who's moved overseas, and I don't think we've actually mentioned where overseas you are. So let's give people a quick synopsis of the amazing world of Geoff.
Okay. Well, 4 years ago, my wife, my now wife, we were living together, me and my wife, planning on getting married, and her father became very ill. So we decided that I would give up. I was basically doing relief work for all of these places I was working, a little private practice. We got up. We basically. Okay, see, Dave, we got a bit of a problem here. Someone's coming to the office.
Right. Okay.
Just give us 1 minute. It's from another office. Okay, no problem. Sorry about that. Yeah, so basically 4 years ago, I had my life in London. I was a qualified carpenter, leaving behind an industry, the film industry, which I worked in for many years, and then came to Brazil. I set up a very small private practice from home after maybe a year because I was worried about the BACP registration. I think it was only 2 years I could stay with them without practicing. So I set up a small business from my apartment. And then what happened was I got some English people that originally English that I was helping and supporting and doing some decent work, and then a Canadian. And then a couple of them said to me, oh, if you could get nearer central Sao Paulo, you know, probably arguably the most famous road in Brazil, arguably, there's one in Rio as well, you can imagine. If you could get further nearer to there, and we wouldn't have to travel, you know, there's people I think that would like your service. So they kind of like prompted me into giving it a go. So I found an office, a little office, and I started from there. My practice grew. And then before I knew it, I was pushing my maximum of 20 clients a week sometimes. So that's kind of how I got where I am. In my wildest dreams, when I was training as a therapist, I qualified about 8 or 9 years ago, I guess. I would never have believed for one moment that I would be sitting in an office in Sao Paulo, in one of the most famous roads in this country, and practicing with Canadians, Americans, Europeans. As long as you've got your English as your first language, I'll support you. And I've had to create this as well. This just didn't happen. I had to get advice from in my insurance company. I had to get advice from, because I do practice from home on the Skype as well. I'm registered in the UK, but I work here. I've had to get a contract signed by my clients to say if there was ever a dispute here in Brazil, that they would take it up with the governing body, which, you know, we argue is the governing body, the BACP, or, you know, would go for my insurance company in the UK as somebody would if there was a dispute in the UK. So I've had to create a contract that has to come into my contracting and things like that. It's many things, many bridges I've had to cross here. But luckily I've got a supervisor that worked here before me, and he crossed a lot of these bridges and luckily passed them over to me. So that was really helpful.
Yeah, I think for a lot of professionals, and I see it as a coach, who, when people start out and the organic growth of a business kind of is the leading kind of edge, if you like, and people start recommending you, and all of a sudden you're now at 20 clients, and all of a sudden the formalities of the business side become a real point of focus. And what I kind of see is that it's almost like professionals are then having to play catch up.
Well, everything falls on me here as well, because a lot of the psychologists and therapists in Brazil will have like a colleague of mine next door who's become a very good friend of mine, a friend of mine, a psychiatrist, has his own secretary, and she will do his notes, and she will help him. Well, we are ethically not allowed to use secretary because of my confidentiality.
Yeah.
So where they have a life, it's really quite easy, and kind of they can share the responsibility and contract for that. I'm personally, I don't know whether we could. It's a good question whether we were allowed to. I'm sure if we contracted, we probably could bring in a PA as a person that was part of the group. It would never go outside. But I wouldn't be comfortable with that. You know, we're talking about some pretty sensitive information by, you know, in Brazil, some semi-famous people at times, and big business people and stuff like that. They could be recognised, I guess, by somebody. And so I have no support, where in the psychologist, the system here allows for a lot of support. So what it lands all back on me. So you imagine that I work a couple of days online, a couple of days in my office. I can use a dictaphone to take some recordings down about my notes, but ultimately I have to sit there and do all my notes myself. The work becomes, if you've got 18, 19 different clients I like doing in-depth notes because I like to see a picture when I read through my notes, to do summaries and stuff. I like to see things that the notes bring out. You can imagine my week's pretty busy with nobody to help me as well. You know, not that many of us get that in the UK, I guess, but yeah.
I think the thing that always inspires me when I speak to you, Geoff, and it's something that's kind of comes up almost every time that we've spoken, is that the commitment that you put into that work. There is no if, but, or maybe, and there's no kind of softening of your practice because of the environment you're in. And for me, when we're talking about the cultural differences of working overseas, that's something that I think only strengthens your scope with clients rather than weakens it.
I think you're right. I think, you know, one of the biggest things that we all face here, me and my clients, is obviously, they say in Portuguese, saudade, which is very difficult to translate. It's a longing. It's a longing for, I guess, is probably about the closest as we can get, and that doesn't really touch it. It's that feeling of homesickness, of longing, of missing, all of these words. And I had it. I don't feel it so much these days, a bit more at the moment because of Christmas. So that's one thing that we all deal with. My clients come here and they take on big contracts with big companies that can really advance their kind of salaries and their lifestyles, because it's 5-1, I think, at the moment, the English pound with the reais. In real terms, it's probably more like 3-1. But you can imagine if you were getting paid £50,000, you could live here very well on half of that. So they come here with some of this in mind, and then all of a sudden you start to realise that you feel saudade, you feel this longing. And also, when I first came here, I was considering buying an armoured car, which we call blindado, which is a car that will stop a bullet up to an AK-47. Now that's kind of the other part that doesn't really get spoken about. And one of my friends said to me, "Are you sure you really want to live somewhere where you're thinking of buying an armoured car?" And we kind of laughed. And I said, "Well, it's funny how I'm attracted to these kinds of things. That's another story." But you know, we're laughing, but there's a very serious side to that. You know, Brazil, you'd be unlucky because I think it's about 35 million of us in São Paulo, central. You know, the central state of São Paulo. So you'd have to be unlucky still, but it happens. And I know people it's happened to. You get dragged out your car by 2 or 3 young guys with guns, They take your car, your wallet, your phone, everything, and as long as you do exactly what they say, they're going to leave you with your life. The problem with us gringos, certainly in the first year or two, if somebody shouts very quickly in Portuguese at somebody that doesn't speak the language very well, you're going to maybe piss them off. So this is the reality of what we live in, culturally different than at home. And the language barrier then could become a life or death scenario. So then I was thinking, okay, I'm not great at languages, I'm learning slowly. Buy an armoured car. I looked into it, very expensive. The glass only lasts approximately 10 years. So you've got to buy one. If I'm staying here for 5 years, I've got to buy one that's less than 5 years old, blah, blah, blah. And you can imagine, but that's the kind of things I was up against. So I'm dealing with that. I'm working with my clients. We're dealing with kind of these kinds of things and other things as well, as we know. So that's the kind of balancing that I've had to deal with and still be stable and solid enough to run a practice. And so it takes a lot. It takes a lot.
And just that cultural dynamic of, I know you took a year to kind of find your feet and go through that process. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why I think both Siobhan and I were so keen to be able to say to anyone who's starting out in private practice, here's the baseline, here's the starter pack that can take some of that pressure off. Because we know in the world of therapy, in the world of coaching, the litigation opportunities are just increasing. And to be able for a new professional, whether they're in their home country, whether they're overseas, to be able to have that pressure of what do I need to have in place, taken care of, and have that baseline there is something that we kind of focus on, because we understand what that can be like, and the almost the reinventing of the wheel when you've got your back up against the overall environment in which you're having to work anyway. And I think that's something that you've kind of already kind of touched on, is you've got a situation where everything's growing organically, but you've got all of the other factors on the outside of the business to take into account. And
and also I didn't buy an armoured car actually. The year before we came here, my wife was on the phone to me. I was in England working. I'll give you an idea of what happened. She was painting the outside of her father's wall. He was becoming quite ill, and she put a little kind of mural on the outside of the wall. And I was talking to her as it was happening. Next thing, the phone went dead, and I heard nothing from her for hours. This is my wife, so you can imagine how I felt. It turned out that a guy had come along with a gun, stuck her up, took her phone, hit her in the face with the gun, give her a really bad black eye. This was the year before we come. So you can imagine I had that coming here. And, you're talking about the first year is not only doing your homework. We did a recce before I came. I didn't mention that, but we came here and stayed here for a while. And during that time, I went back to England during that time that she was robbed, and she was with her brother and her niece. Our niece then was about 11, I think, or 10. So you can imagine how traumatic that is. And she still wanted to come here. That's how brave my wife is. They're culturally different than us because they've grown up with this. Yeah. It's getting worse, of course. I couldn't have practiced in that first year because of what all of that done to me. We're talking about having time to kind of like get your feet firmly on the ground. I couldn't have practiced. I looked into it and decided that I was too all over the place. I mean, I admire my courage for what I've done, but I realised I've got my limits also. My limits were to limit it to a very small group and slowly see how I could cope with my life here and what I was capable of giving.
Yeah. And that shows the very core of what Siobhan and I have set up, is self-awareness allows us to be able to do that for the benefit of those that we work with. And the trauma before arriving, the trauma of your father-in-law becoming ill, the trauma of the cultural shock. And it's something that I know Margaret would be jumping all over and enjoying that conversation around the cultural differences and that sensitivity amongst that. But for a professional to be able to say, I am not in a position to support people at this moment, is something that has always inspired more confidence in that individual than those who say, I have to work, therefore I'm working, and everything else can just sit at the door and wait. And I admire you for it, and I pay kudos to you for where you've been through and where you're at now. Also to your wife and your family there in Brazil. I suppose one big question that really kind of came up from the round table for me anyway was the organic development of your practice, your self-awareness of not rushing it at this, and using other skills if you needed to in that intervening period. What would you say is your biggest kind of personal accomplishment in that process?
Well, that's interesting, because I think it's interesting because I nearly failed in the UK, because I came out of an industry that we worked very, very hard, like 12 or 13 hours a day and often weekends, and would do silly hours in the film industry and running my own business for many years, trying to do a bit of voluntary work on the side and pushing myself very hard. When I became, my first couple of years as a therapist, I became very engrossed and wanted to really embrace this, like I do everything in my life, to be the best therapist, to be the most rounded, to work with children, with adults, to work in addiction, which was my passion, and I studied for many years before I became a therapist. So I kind of brought that ethos into therapy, which was a mistake, a big mistake, because you can't, you know, I thought, okay, both of my tutors said, if you want to make money, don't be a therapist. It looks like on paper we earn a lot of money per hour. But when I looked at what I used to earn, actually I took quite a considerable drop. But I'm thinking, okay, 40 hours a week, 40 clients a week, you know, and I can still earn a bit of money and keep my lifestyle. And I failed at that. My bringing my strengths over into this industry, thinking like I was as a carpenter and working for the model unit for some of the films and whatever, failed. And I semi-burnt out, because I thought that I could do what it was that I could do previously, not thinking a caring profession actually is more tiring. You doing half the work in the caring profession is more tiring than doing twice as much work physically. Yeah, for me. So I burnt out almost. I remember coming home one from school and sitting in an armchair in the dark and taking an hour or two to recover. I thought, hang on, I'm in no shape here to carry on. And I was at college the next day, and I said to my tutor, I think I'm going to quit this. Because this isn't what I signed up for, and you know, like hearing about children being abused and all these kinds of things, and working with adults that have been abused and addiction, all of what it was doing to me was thrown all over the place. She said to me, I'm not going to allow you to quit. Please come and see me in the morning, my home. And she gave me a one-to-one session, and it turned me around. What I learned from that session, and she offered me more after, was that I have to completely change my mindset about what it is I came from to what it is I'm in now. This isn't a case of using all of them strategies. Yes, using some, working out what was helpful and what wasn't, and completely re-looking at everything about myself, about how I worked previously, about this enthusiasm. I've had to kill a lot of my enthusiasm for this work almost, because it was detrimental to me more than my clients, I think, but ultimately my clients, if I burn out. So it was like learning that I almost burnt out and broke. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough.
Yeah.
And learning that was one of the biggest things that I've done over the last 10 years. And that has allowed me to come here and say, I'm not ready to practice. So I would teach English for a year. It's easy, right? Compared with it's not easy, but compared with practicing a relational depth, which I like to practice at, there's a big difference between the two jobs. Yeah. So it was failure, if you like, that brought me success, I guess, if I like to put it like that.
I mean, I can totally equate to that kind of running at one level at one set of speeds, and that allows you to fly level and fly fast. And all of a sudden the air changes, and now you need to actually bring the elevators and bring that speed down. You're not taking
considerably
any of what you can do, but you're now in a different environment, and running at that speed, as you say, becomes counterproductive, not only to you but to those that are around you. And I have been through burnout. I have physically burnt out. When I was working in the hospitality sector, I worked 3 years almost non-stop, because I was just learning the business, and I was flying high and fast.
And society wants us to be like that now. This is the capitalist societal system that is to succeed. It's almost like you've got to work the longest and the hardest, unless you're the very bright. So it's kind of encouraging. We come into a field where we've got to almost like completely shut that down, that idea. Yeah. If we don't, it will shut us down.
Yeah. And this is where really the work that even up to the presentation that I gave last month, or part of which looked at mindsets, and the idea that we've got to a point for the majority of us where we're forward motion thinking, and we're racing forward the whole time, and we're on this kind of and some people will call it a treadmill, some people will call it the hamster wheel. It's just this, I've got to be constantly moving, and the problem with that is it's like being on a unicycle. That single wheel that we just have to keep moving, otherwise it will fall. And when you then get coaches who come along and say, yeah, that's great, you're doing absolutely fabulous, what we need to do is get you another person in your network who's a similar level and working a similar way to you are. Well, that's just having two unicycles clumped together. And
then we wonder why that we're treating our clients with anxiety, and the biggest cause of anxiety is projection and not living in the here and now. And how can we live in the here and now when society's telling us we've got to run faster?
Exactly.
So there's part of the problem, and that's part of the problem going back to me becoming a therapist. The film industry, I remember when I got a break I did a bit of work for my uncle as a stagehand when I was young. And a friend of mine he was working on Harry Potter, the model unit. He said, you did a bit of stage work, didn't you? A bit of stage. I said, yeah. And he said, right, can you come in and help us? We're struggling a bit. The model grew this year or whatever. It was one of the first years, second year, I think. And I remember speaking to the AD, the assistant director, saying to me, by the way, Geoff, the only funeral you can have time off for is your own. It was one of the first things he said to me. Yeah. And it was kind of part joke, but kind of part serious when you get into it. And that's the kind of message we're getting from society. The pressure was on me before I got my foot in the door. If you accept, that's what you're accepting. People, I remember having food poisoning going to work. They sent me home because I was so sick. But that's the kind of pressure that you're under. The opposite to self-care, right? Self-care, the opposite. On the treadmills, the opposite to self-care. How can we be in the moment and live like this life and enjoy it when we're being forced to look forward too far? And also the pressure of what if this comes along, you have to behave like that.
Exactly. And this is something that that Siobhan talks about quite regularly, is taking that split second to just go, do I need to take that extra step? Do I need just to hold back and just think about the importance of where that next step is placed? And I think it's something that
self-awareness. Absolutely.
It totally comes back to self-awareness. And
the thing is, self-awareness is massively important, but it still has its limitations. When I look back to when I burnt out, I've always been very aware, because I think I've told you before, I went through rehab when I was younger, and the ethos was to be as aware as you can of the pitfalls of alcohol use or drug use as you possibly can. That was the ethos of Phoenix House. So I came out of that totally aware, and I've always encouraged that self-awareness. I've had my problems, but I've always encouraged it in myself. So when I burnt out, I got home that night, I sat in that armchair and went, wow, what happened to me? I could only sit in the dark. I did not see that coming.
Yeah.
What I should have been aware of was the triggers or the lead up to that. Because I'd never experienced it, the awareness was useless.
Yeah. The awareness hit you until you're already on the deck.
So now I've been on the deck, now I can recognize it. Now my awareness is wonderful, but it's almost like allowing ourselves to fail to be able to recognize our failures as positive, to be able to move on. Then the awareness is priceless.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of some other motivational coaches. I don't buy into the whole motivational speech. That really doesn't work for me. Bearing in mind that I was coached in the sports world, and the motivational coaching stuff that comes from there is off the chart. But the idea that if we want people to succeed, they must be allowed to fail often and fail regularly. And
be supported. Be supported while you're failing. You know, the professionals around me never saw it coming. And I had a tutor. I had two managers and a supervisor, two supervisors, separate supervisors through separate organisations. And not one of them saw that until it hit me.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where it will always come down to what are the building blocks for that individual to that point in time. And, you know, it's something that I know you've spoken about. We've had conversations around those building blocks and allowing people, when in what might be perceived as a fail or a fall, it's what happens around it at that moment, and allowing that not to be left as a void, and picking that up and going, right, well, what do we actually get out from this? What was that trigger? Where do we take that? how do we actually make sure that we're not tripping over the same brick again?
Exactly.